In the cold, white corridor of a hospital, Mason Reed signed the divorce papers without looking up. His daughter lay behind a glass door, machines breathing where she struggled to. Nurses paused. A doctor lowered his chart, and still he said it, calm, sharp, final. I won't spend my life tied to weakness. Across from him, Paula Patterson did not argue. She did not cry. She simply held the pen, signed her name, and let the silence settle. Her phone vibrated. A single email. $36, 000000000, contract approved. Mason walked away before the future turned against him. If you believe silence is sometimes stronger than words, stay with this story until the end. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment. And if stories of truth, consequence, and quiet strength matter to you, consider subscribing. The first time Paula Patterson noticed the shift, it was not loud. There was no argument, no slammed doors, no confession waiting to be uncovered. It was the absence of something that used to be there. Mason Reed used to come home with a certain rhythm. Not early, not particularly attentive, but present enough to be counted. He would drop his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, loosen his tie, and ask, almost out of habit, how Lily had been that day. Now the keys came later. Sometimes not at all. And the question had disappeared. Paula did not ask why. She noticed instead. She noticed how his shoes changed sleeker, newer, not something he would usually prioritize. She noticed how his phone stayed face down on the table, even when it vibrated. She noticed the faint trace of a different cologne, one that did not belong to him, but lingered on him like something borrowed. Paula did not confront him. She adjusted. At 34, Paula had built a mind that worked quietly beneath the surface. She had never been loud about her intelligence, never needed to be. Her work did not reward noise. It rewarded precision, patience, and the ability to see what others overlooked. She worked as a senior strategic consultant for a firm that did not advertise its most important clients: governments, multinational corporations, private equity groups, people who did not want their decisions traced back to a single name. Paula was not the face of anything. She was the one who understood how systems moved. And more importantly, how they broke. At home, she carried that same stillness. Their daughter, Lily Reed, was 6 years old and far too familiar with hospital ceilings. Congenital heart disease, the doctors had called it. A phrase that had entered their lives before Lily had learned to walk and had never quite left. Lily had learned early not to complain. She spoke softly, smiled easily, and asked questions that did not belong to a child her age. Mom, she had said once, her small fingers tracing the line of Paula's sleeve. Do hearts get tired of trying? Paula had not answered immediately. She had looked at her daughter, really looked, and then said gently, some hearts just work harder than others. That's all. Lily had accepted that. Mason had not been in the room when she asked. In the early years, he had tried. There had been appointments he attended nights. He stayed awake moments when fear had cracked through his composure. But fear, Paula understood, did not always create strength. Sometimes it created distance. Over time, Mason's presence had shifted from engaged to reluctant, then from reluctant to irritated. The hospital bills arrived with quiet regularity. Insurance covered part of it, but never enough. There were always additional procedures, unexpected complications, consultations that carried numbers too large to be ignored. Paula handled most of it. She tracked every invoice, negotiated every payment plan, adjusted their finances with a discipline that bordered on surgical. She never announced what she was doing. She simply ensured that Lily's care continued. Mason, meanwhile, began to measure things differently. It started with small comments. Do we really need another consultation? He had asked one evening, not looking up from his phone. The cardiologist recommended it. Paula replied, "They always recommend more," Mason muttered. "That's how they make money." Paula did not respond. Not because she agreed, but because she understood that the conversation was not about medicine. It was about cost. Weeks passed, then months. Mason's late nights became routine. His explanations grew shorter. Work, meetings, deadlines. Each word delivered without detail, as if detail itself had become an inconvenience. Paula did not ask for clarification. Instead, she watched. She watched how he reacted when Lily's name came up in conversations about expenses. She watched how quickly he changed the subject when future treatments were discussed. She watched the subtle tightening of his jaw when the word hospital entered the room. And she wrote things down. Not in a way that would be discovered, not in a visible notebook or an obvious file. Paula's records lived in patterns, dates, times, behaviors. She remembered when he stopped eating dinner with them. She remembered when he stopped checking Lily's medication schedule. She remembered the first time he left the house after a hospital call without asking how she was doing. Each moment stored not for confrontation, but for understanding. Because Paula did not believe in reacting without a full picture, one evening Lily fell asleep on the couch, her small body curled beneath a blanket that had long since lost its softness. The television played quietly in the background, something bright and animated that she had stopped watching hours ago. Paula adjusted the blanket and brushed a strand of hair away from her daughter's forehead. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket. An email. She glanced at the sender, not personal, professional. She stepped into the kitchen before opening it. The subject line was brief, but it carried weight. Preliminary approval, phase 3. Negotiation. Paula read it once, then again. The project had been in motion for months, complex, layered, and deliberately obscured behind multiple entities. She had not discussed it at home. There had been no reason to. It was not something Mason would have understood or valued. The numbers involved were significant, but Paula did not focus on the numbers. She focused on structure, on control, on the long-term implications of decisions being made by people who believed they were acting independently. She typed a short reply, precise, direct, confirming her availability for the next phase. Then she closed the email. When she returned to the living room, Mason was standing by the door. He had not been there when she left. "I'm heading out," he said. Paula nodded. "Will you be back tonight?" He hesitated, only for a second. Late. It was not an answer, but it was enough. She did not ask where he was going. He did not offer. The door closed behind him with a quiet finality that lingered longer than the sound itself. Paula stood there for a moment, her gaze resting on the empty space he had occupied. Then she turned back to Lily. She lifted her gently, careful not to wake her, and carried her to the bedroom. The weight in her arms was familiar. Light but not fragile, resilient. Paula tucked her in, adjusted the blanket, and turned off the light. In the darkness, Lily stirred slightly. "Mom, I'm here," Paula whispered. A pause. Then softly, "Will Dad come say goodnight?" Paula did not answer immediately. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand resting lightly against Lily's arm. "He's busy tonight," she said. Lily nodded as if she had expected that. "Okay." Within minutes, her breathing evened out again. Paula remained seated for a while longer, not because she was unsure, but because she was measuring something. Time, patterns, choices. When she finally stood, she did so quietly. In the kitchen, her phone buzzed again. Another email, this one shorter, more definitive. Pending final confirmation. Contract value, $36 billion. Paula read the number without reacting. No surprise, no visible shift, just a quiet acknowledgement. She set the phone down on the counter and looked out the window. The night outside was still, unremarkable. Exactly the kind of night where nothing appeared to change. And yet beneath that stillness, movement had already begun. Not sudden, not dramatic, but precise. Paula Patterson did not need to announce what was coming. She only needed to let it unfold. The shift from distance to detachment did not happen overnight. It unfolded in fragments, each small enough to be dismissed on its own, but together forming something Paula Patterson could no longer ignore. Lily's condition worsened at the start of early spring. It was not dramatic at first, a little more fatigue than usual, a faintness in her voice after walking short distances. The kind of changes that might have gone unnoticed in another child, but Paula noticed. She noticed how Lily paused halfway up the stairs, pretending to tie her shoelaces just to catch her breath. She noticed how her daughter smiled through discomfort, as if protecting the adults around her from the truth her body was quietly revealing. Paula scheduled another appointment. Dr. Harris did not soften his words this time. "The progression is faster than we anticipated," he said, his voice measured but firm. "We need to consider surgical intervention sooner rather than later." The room felt smaller after that. Paula asked the questions that mattered: risks, recovery, timeline, cost. Dr. Harris answered each one carefully, but there was no hiding the reality beneath his clinical tone. "This isn't optional anymore," he added. "Waiting increases the danger." Paula nodded. She had already understood that before he said it. Mason arrived late to that appointment. He entered the room halfway through the conversation, his expression unreadable, his presence more obligation than concern. "What did I miss?" he asked, glancing briefly at Lily before looking at the doctor. Dr. Harris repeated the summary: surgery, urgency, risk. Mason's reaction was not immediate. He processed it in silence, his gaze drifting toward the window, as if the information required distance to be absorbed. "And the cost?" he asked finally. Paula did not look at him. Dr. Harris hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "It will be significant," he said, "even with insurance." That was the moment something shifted, not in the room, in Mason. Paula saw it in the tightening of his posture, in the subtle way his jaw set in the absence of any follow-up question about Lily's chances, her recovery, her pain. Only the cost had anchored his attention. They left the hospital together, but not as a unit. Lily held Paula's hand. Mason walked a step ahead. Outside, the air carried the kind of crispness that belonged to a changing season. People moved past them without noticing, absorbed in their own routines, their own concerns. "Can we get ice cream?" Lily asked softly, looking up at Paula. Paula smiled gently. "After your next checkup," she said. "We'll make it a celebration." Lily nodded, satisfied with the promise. Mason did not respond. That evening, Paula reviewed the hospital estimate. The numbers were high, but they were not unexpected. She adjusted their financial projections, reallocated funds, and outlined a plan that would ensure Lily's treatment proceeded without interruption. She did not include Mason in that process, not because she intended to exclude him, but because she understood with increasing clarity that he had already excluded himself. Later that night, Mason stepped out onto the balcony with his phone. He did not know Paula could see his reflection in the glass. His posture was different, relaxed. His voice when he spoke carried a tone Paula had not heard directed at her in months. "I told you it's complicated," he said, pacing slowly. "There's a lot going on right now." A pause, then a softer tone. "I know. I miss you too." Paula did not move. She did not need to hear the other side of the conversation to understand it. The pattern had already been established. The name confirmed it the next day: Chloe Bennett. Paula saw it in a message preview when Mason left his phone unattended for the briefest moment. Not hidden well enough. Not careful enough. Last night was perfect. That was all it said. Paula did not open the message. She did not need to. Instead, she made a note. Time, date, context. And then she continued with her day. Chloe Bennett was not subtle. Within weeks, her presence began to overlap with Mason's life in ways that extended beyond secrecy. There were charges on the account that did not align with Mason's usual spending patterns. Upscale restaurants, boutique hotels, purchases that suggested a lifestyle shift rather than a momentary indulgence. Paula tracked each one, not with anger, with precision. Lily's condition required increasing attention. Her energy levels dropped more noticeably. There were days she did not want to get out of bed, days when even her quiet resilience seemed to falter. Paula adjusted her schedule accordingly. Work calls were taken from hospital corridors, documents reviewed in waiting rooms, emails answered in the quiet hours of the night when Lily finally slept. Through it all, Paula remained composed. Not distant, not cold, but focused. One afternoon, as Lily rested, Paula stepped into a quiet corner of the hospital and checked her phone. Another email, Phase 3, confirmed final negotiations, imminent. The words carried weight, but Paula did not react outwardly. She read the attached details carefully. The structure of the deal was becoming clearer, the scale more defined, the implications far-reaching. This was not just a contract, it was leverage. Paula closed the email and looked down the corridor. Mason was not there. He had stopped coming to most of the appointments. His explanations when offered were brief and unconvincing. Work's been crazy. I've got deadlines. You've got it covered, right? Paula always answered the same way. Yes, not as reassurance, as fact. That evening, Mason returned home later than usual. He carried with him a faint trace of perfume that did not belong in their house. Paula was in the kitchen preparing something simple for Lily. "You didn't answer my call earlier," Mason said, dropping his keys onto the counter. "I was at the hospital," Paula replied, her tone even. "You're always at the hospital," he said, a hint of irritation slipping through. Paula paused, then continued what she was doing. "Lily needed me." Mason exhaled as if the conversation itself was exhausting. "We can't keep doing this," he said. "It's not sustainable." Paula turned to face him. For a moment their eyes met. "What part?" she asked. Mason hesitated. Then, with a shrug that attempted to minimize the weight of his own words, he said, "All of it." Paula held his gaze for a second longer than necessary. Then she nodded. "Okay." There was no argument, no escalation, just acknowledgement. Mason seemed almost unsettled by the lack of resistance. He had expected something else, a reaction, a plea. He did not receive it. Later that night, Paula sat at the kitchen table after Lily had gone to sleep. Her laptop was open in front of her, but she was not typing. She was reviewing. Messages, transactions, dates, patterns, everything aligned. Not perfectly, but clearly enough. Her phone buzzed again. Another email. Short, direct, final approval pending, estimated value. $36 billion, Paula read it once. Then closed her eyes briefly. Not in relief, not in anticipation, but in recognition. The timeline was narrowing. Events were converging, and choices, both hers and Mason's, were approaching their consequences. In the bedroom, Lily stirred. Paula closed the laptop and stood. As she walked down the hallway, the house felt unusually quiet. Not peaceful, just empty in a way that had not yet been acknowledged out loud. Paula stepped into Lily's room and sat beside her. "I'm here," she said softly, before Lily even opened her eyes. Lily relaxed at the sound of her voice, and in that moment, Paula understood something with complete clarity. Not everything needed to be confronted. Some things only needed to be seen, and then allowed to unfold. Paula Patterson did not discover the truth all at once. It arrived in pieces, not hidden well enough to be invisible, but scattered just enough to seem accidental to anyone who was not looking closely. Paula was always looking closely. The first confirmation came on a Tuesday morning. Mason had left for work earlier than usual, moving through the house with a quiet urgency that felt rehearsed. He had taken a call before stepping out, his voice lowered, his tone softened in a way Paula no longer associated with her. Paula did not interrupt. She waited until the door closed. Then she moved through the morning as she always did, preparing Lily's medication, reviewing the day's appointments, organizing her own schedule around hospital visits and remote work. It was not until later, when she reached for Mason's tablet to check a shared calendar entry, that she saw it. A notification banner, brief, careless, Chloe Bennett. Same place tonight. Paula did not open the message. She did not need to. Instead, she memorized it. The time, the phrasing, the implication. Then she set the tablet back exactly where it had been. Nothing about her movement suggested discovery. Nothing about her expression changed, but something within her adjusted, not emotionally, structurally. That evening, while Lily rested in her room, Paula sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open. Her work file remained untouched. Instead, she opened a separate document. It was not labeled. It did not contain names in obvious ways. But it held information, carefully arranged, dates, times, locations. Paula began to reconstruct Mason's movements. She cross-referenced calendar entries with transaction histories. She aligned timestamps with patterns of absence. She noted inconsistencies not as accusations, but as data points. She did not rush. Precision required patience. The next piece came 2 days later. A charge appeared on their joint account. A boutique hotel in downtown Chicago. Midweek, 2 nights. Mason had told her he would be traveling for work. He had not mentioned the hotel. Paula clicked into the transaction details. The amount was high enough to suggest more than convenience. She added it to her document. Another line, another pattern. Still no confrontation. Not because she was unsure, but because confrontation at this stage would interrupt the process. And Paula was not interested in interruption. She was interested in clarity. Lily's condition continued to demand attention. There were days when Paula moved seamlessly between roles, mother caretaker strategist without pause. She administered medication with steady hands, asked doctors the right questions, and absorbed information without allowing it to overwhelm her. At the hospital, she remained composed. Dr. Harris noticed. "You're handling this better than most," he said during one visit, his tone carrying a quiet respect. Paula offered a small nod. "I'm doing what needs to be done." It was not humility, it was accuracy. Mason was not present that day. He had stopped attending most appointments entirely. His absence was no longer explained. It was assumed. Later that week, Paula encountered Chloe Bennett for the first time. Not intentionally, not dramatically. It happened in a space that was neither private nor public enough to draw attention, a high-end cafe near the financial district where Paula occasionally worked between meetings. Chloe sat near the window. She was exactly as Paula had expected. Younger, polished, dressed with a careful balance of effort and ease, the kind of presence designed to attract attention without appearing to seek it. She laughed at something on her phone. Her posture relaxed, her expression open, in a way that suggested she believed she was where she was meant to be. Paula did not approach her. She did not need to. Observation from a distance was enough. Chloe wore a bracelet Paula recognized. A delicate gold piece Mason had purchased months earlier, supposedly as a gift for a colleague's birthday. Paula had not questioned it then. She did now, not with emotion, with confirmation. She left the cafe without making her presence known. There was nothing to gain from being seen. Back home, Paula added another layer to her records. Not just transactions, not just messages, but physical evidence, descriptions, locations, connections, everything aligned. Mason was not hiding well. He was simply relying on the assumption that Paula would not look. That assumption was incorrect. Days passed. Then another week. The pattern intensified. More charges, more absences, more inconsistencies. Paula documented each one. Not obsessively, systematically. Her work life continued in parallel. The project she had been quietly managing entered its final stages. Emails arrived with increasing frequency. Language shifted from tentative to definitive. Final structuring phase. Immediate response required legal framework, confirmed, awaiting sign-off. Each message carried weight. Each required careful attention. Paula responded with the same precision she applied to everything else. Short, clear, decisive. She worked with Ethan Cole, the legal advisor assigned to the deal, and Rachel Stein, the financial strategist overseeing the asset flow. Their communications were efficient, professional, focused entirely on execution. No one outside that circle knew Paula's level of involvement. That was intentional. At home, Mason's behavior grew less cautious. He no longer checked his phone as frequently for visibility. He no longer explained his absences in detail. He had moved from concealment to assumption. He assumed distance had already justified his actions. He assumed silence meant acceptance. One evening, Paula noticed a transfer. Not a purchase, a direct transfer from their joint account. The amount was significant, large enough to disrupt the balance Paula had been maintaining for Lily's medical expenses. She traced it. The destination account was unfamiliar, but the pattern was not. It aligned with previous transactions connected to Chloe. Paula did not react immediately. She reviewed the account history. She identified similar transfers smaller in size spread over the past few weeks. This one was different, larger, more deliberate. A shift from incidental spending to sustained support. Paula documented it. Then she adjusted. She began separating financial structures, not visibly, not in a way that would alert Mason, but strategically. Accounts were reorganized, access points limited, safeguards implemented, all within legal boundaries, all without announcement. That night, Mason returned home later than usual. There was no attempt to explain, no acknowledgement of the transfer. Paula was in the living room, reviewing Lily's medication schedule. "You're still up," Mason asked, his tone neutral. "I needed to finish this," Paula replied. Mason nodded, already moving past her. "I'm going to bed." Paula watched him for a moment. Then she spoke. "Mason." He paused, turned slightly. "Yeah, there was a large transfer from the joint account today." A brief silence, then a shrug. "I had some expenses," he said. "I'll cover it." Paula held his gaze. "Make sure you do." There was no accusation in her tone, no emotion, just a statement. Mason seemed momentarily unsettled by the lack of reaction. He had expected something else. A question, a challenge. He received neither. "Yeah," he said again, less certain this time. "I will." He disappeared down the hallway. Paula returned to her notes, not because the conversation was unimportant, but because it had confirmed what she already knew. And confirmation for Paula was more valuable than confrontation. Her phone buzzed softly on the table beside her. Another email. She opened it. Final approval scheduled. Contract value $36, 000000000. The number remained the same. The implication had not changed, but the timing had. Everything was aligning. Paula closed the email and looked around the room. The house was quiet, unchanged on the surface. But beneath that stillness, structures were shifting. Not visibly, not yet, but inevitably. Paula Patterson did not need to expose the truth. She only needed to be ready when it revealed itself. And she was already there. The transfer was not a mistake. Paula Patterson confirmed that within hours. It followed a pattern that had been forming for weeks, only now it had crossed a threshold that made it impossible to ignore. Not emotionally, Paula had already moved past that, but structurally. Money, she understood, was never just money. It was intent. It was direction. It revealed priorities long before words ever did. Paula reviewed the account again late that night, long after Mason had fallen asleep. The numbers were clear. The destination account was the same one that had received smaller transfers before incremental, almost cautious amounts that suggested testing rather than commitment. This transfer was different. It was commitment. She traced the timeline. The increase had coincided with a series of higher-end purchases, a lease agreement in a luxury building, recurring payments to a private parking structure, and a recent charge from an automotive dealership known for premium inventory. Paula did not need confirmation of ownership. The pattern itself was confirmation. Chloe Bennett was no longer an expense. She had become an investment. Paula closed the banking interface and opened her document. She added the transfer. Then she added context. She did not label it as betrayal. She labeled it as reallocation. Because that was what it was. Mason was reallocating shared resources toward a life he had not yet fully declared. And Paula was documenting it. The next morning, Lily woke with a low fever. It was not uncommon, but it required attention. Paula adjusted the schedule immediately. Medications were administered, calls were made. Dr. Harris was informed. By mid-morning, they were back at the hospital. The familiarity of the space no longer felt clinical. It felt routine, predictable in ways that life outside those walls was not. Lily rested against Paula's shoulder as they waited. "Mom," she said softly, her voice thinner than usual. "Are we going to stay here again?" "Just for a little while," Paula replied. "We're making sure everything's okay." Lily nodded, her small hand gripping Paula's sleeve. "Will Dad come?" Paula paused. Not long enough to draw attention. "Maybe later," she said. Lily accepted the answer without question. Acceptance, Paula had learned, often came from repetition. Dr. Harris entered the room with a file in hand. He reviewed Lily's chart, his expression composed but focused. "We're seeing increased strain," he said. "It's consistent with what we discussed last week." Paula listened carefully. "We need to move forward with the surgical plan," he continued. "Delaying further isn't in her best interest." Paula nodded. "I understand." Dr. Harris glanced toward the empty chair beside her. Is Mason aware of the urgency? Paula did not hesitate. "He's been informed." It was not inaccurate. Information had been shared. Whether it had been received was another matter. Dr. Harris did not press further. Instead, he outlined the next steps. Preoperative assessments, scheduling, financial authorization. Each component required coordination. Each carried weight. Paula absorbed it all without interruption. When the doctor left the room, returned to its quiet state. Lily had drifted back to sleep. Paula adjusted the blanket around her and reached for her phone. Another email. She stepped into the hallway before opening it. Final legal review completed. Awaiting signature authorization, Paula read it once. Then again. Everything was in place. The structure had been finalized. The contingencies addressed. The financial pathways secured. All that remained was execution. She typed a response. Short, confirming availability for final authorization. Then she locked the phone and returned to Lily's side. Mason did not come that day. He sent a message instead. "Busy. Keep me updated." Paula read it, then set the phone aside. There was nothing to update that he had not already chosen to ignore. Later that evening, after Lily had been admitted for observation, Paula returned home briefly to gather additional items. The house was quiet, unchanged, but something felt different. Not in the space itself, in its alignment. Paula moved through the rooms methodically. Bedroom, closet, bathroom. Then she stopped. Mason's closet was partially empty, not noticeably at first glance, but enough. Several shirts were gone, a pair of shoes, a jacket, items selected with intention, not urgency. He was transitioning, not leaving yet, but preparing. Paula noted it, not with surprise, with confirmation. She gathered what she needed and returned to the hospital. That night, Lily slept more restlessly. Paula remained beside her, monitoring, adjusting, responding when needed. The hours passed slowly, measured not by clocks, but by breathing patterns and small movements. Around midnight, Paula's phone vibrated again. A notification. Not an email this time. A transaction alert. Another transfer. Smaller than the last, but directed to the same account. Paula opened it, reviewed it, then closed it. No reaction, only acknowledgement. In the morning, Mason arrived. Not early, not late. But at a time that suggested he had calculated his presence. He entered the room with a controlled expression, as if uncertainty had been replaced with decision. "How is she?" he asked, glancing at Lily. "Stable," Paula replied. Mason nodded. A pause followed. Then he spoke again. "I've been thinking." Paula waited. "We can't keep doing this," he said. "The hospital, the bills, the constant stress. It's not sustainable." The word returned. Paula had heard it before. She met his gaze. "What are you suggesting?" Mason hesitated, then exhaled. "I think we need to start making different choices." The phrasing was careful, deliberate, but not unclear. Paula considered his words, not emotionally, logically, about what she asked. Mason looked away briefly, then back. Everything. There it was. Not yet a declaration, but close. Paula nodded once. "Then be specific." Mason did not answer immediately, because specificity required ownership, and ownership required commitment. He was not there yet. "I just think," he began, then stopped. "We need to think about our future." Paula held his gaze. "I am," she said. Her tone was calm, measured, certain. Mason seemed unsettled by that certainty, as if he had expected resistance or confusion. He received neither. Instead, he found himself facing a version of Paula he did not fully understand. Not because she had changed, but because he had stopped paying attention long enough to lose track of who she had always been. He stayed for a while longer, long enough to feel present, not long enough to be necessary. When he left, Paula did not watch him go. She turned her attention back to Lily, because that was where it belonged. That evening, as the hospital quieted and the corridors emptied, Paula reviewed her notes again. Everything was in place. Financial records, transaction histories, behavioral patterns. And now, the beginning of verbal confirmation. Mason was moving toward a decision, and Paula was already beyond it. Her phone buzzed one last time before she set it aside for the night. An email. She opened it. Authorization window. Open contract value, $36, 000000000. Paula read the message without visible reaction. Then she closed it. Outside the window, the city moved as it always did. Unaware, unchanged. But inside that room, within the quiet space between what had been said and what had yet to be declared, everything was already shifting. Not loudly, not visibly, but completely. By the time the authorization window opened, Paula Patterson had already decided what she would do. Not in a moment of emotion, not in response to Mason's words or his silence, or the slow unraveling of what had once been a shared life. Her decision had formed gradually, shaped by observation, confirmed by patterns, and anchored in something far more stable than reaction: control. Not control over people, but control over outcomes. That was where Paula had always been strongest. The hospital room was dim in the early hours of the morning. Lily slept more steadily now. The fever reduced her breathing, even enough to allow Paula a brief window of stillness. Paula sat beside her laptop, open the glow of the screen reflecting faintly in her eyes. The email remained unread, only in appearance. She had already reviewed its contents in detail. Authorization window open. Contract value $36. 000000000. Below it, layers of documentation, legal frameworks, ownership structures, asset distribution pathways. Everything had been constructed with precision, designed to ensure that control would not be visible, but absolute. Paula did not rush. She reviewed each section again, not because she doubted it, but because she understood that once executed, it would not be undone. Her phone vibrated. A message from Ethan Cole. "We're ready on our end, awaiting your confirmation." Rachel Stein followed minutes later. "Timing is optimal. No external interference detected." Paula read both messages. Then she closed her eyes briefly, not to rest, to focus. The decision was not about the money. It never had been. It was about what the structure would allow her to protect, and what it would allow her to leave behind. She opened the authorization document, scrolled to the final section, and paused. Not because she was uncertain, but because she understood the weight of quiet actions. Then, without hesitation, she signed. Digitally, cleanly, without ceremony. The screen confirmed it within seconds. Authorization complete. No sound, no visible shift. But something fundamental had changed. Paula closed the laptop and returned her attention to Lily, because that was where it belonged. The days that followed did not announce the magnitude of what had just occurred. There were no headlines, no sudden influx of attention. That was by design. The structure Paula had authorized operated beneath visibility, distributing control across entities that did not carry her name. Ownership, in this case, was not about recognition. It was about leverage. At home, Mason continued as he had. If anything, his behavior became more relaxed, less cautious, more certain. He no longer attempted to align his schedule with Paula's. His absences were no longer framed as temporary. They were simply part of a life that was already diverging. Paula observed it without interruption, because interruption would serve no purpose. One afternoon, while Lily rested in a hospital bed, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines, Paula stepped into the hallway to take a call. Ethan's voice was steady. "It's done," he said. "The transfer of controlling interest is complete. The board restructuring will begin within the week." Paula listened. "Any complications?" she asked. "None," Ethan replied. "Everything proceeded exactly as planned. Your position is secure." Paula nodded, though he could not see it. "And the public disclosure," minimal, Ethan said. "The structure shields your involvement. Officially, the acquisition is attributed to the holding group." Paula expected that. "Good," she said. There was a brief pause on the line. Then Ethan added, "You should know this changes the landscape significantly. For several companies, several. Paula understood the implication. She did not ask for specifics. She already knew enough. "Keep me informed," she said. "Of course." The call ended. Paula stood in the hallway for a moment, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. No one passing by would have recognized what had just shifted. That was the point. Inside the room, Lily stirred. Paula returned immediately. Mom Lily's voice was soft. "I'm here," Paula said, taking her hand. Lily smiled faintly. "Did you finish your work?" Paula brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Yes." "Good," Lily whispered. "You always finish things." Paula did not respond. Not because the statement was untrue, but because it carried a simplicity that did not need to be explained. Mason's world, meanwhile, continued to evolve in a different direction. He spent more nights away from home. When he did return, it was with the air of someone who had already detached. Chloe Bennett's presence was no longer an assumption. It was evident. Her belongings began to appear in subtle ways. A jacket left draped over a chair, a pair of shoes near the door that did not belong to Paula. Items that suggested not a visit, but a transition. Paula did not remove them. She did not comment, because acknowledgement would imply negotiation. And Paula was no longer negotiating. One evening, Mason stood in the kitchen reviewing something on his phone. Paula entered quietly, placing Lily's medication on the counter. "We need to talk," Mason said without looking up. Paula waited. "I've been thinking about everything," he continued. "About where things are going." Paula met his gaze, and she asked. Mason exhaled as if preparing himself. "I don't think this is working anymore," he said. "For either of us." Paula nodded once. "I agree," she said. The response caught him off guard. He had expected resistance, or at least hesitation. Instead, he found clarity. "You agree," he repeated. "Yes." The word was simple, uncomplicated, and final. Mason shifted slightly, unsettled by the lack of friction. "I think it would be better if we separated," he said, choosing the word carefully. Paula held his gaze. "Then we should proceed properly," she replied. "No emotion, no escalation, just structure." Mason nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, we should." He returned his attention to his phone, as if the conversation had already concluded. Paula turned back to her task. Because for her, it had. Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Paula sat alone in the living room. Her laptop remained closed. There was nothing left to finalize. Everything had already been set in motion. Her phone vibrated once. An internal update. Board notification, scheduled effective date confirmed. Paula read it, then placed the phone beside her. The room was quiet, still, unchanged. But beneath that stillness, consequences were already moving. Not loudly, not visibly, but with certainty. Paula Patterson did not need to respond to what Mason had chosen. She only needed to allow those choices to reach their natural conclusion. And now, with everything aligned, legally, financially, structurally, that conclusion was no longer distant. It was approaching. Steadily, inevitably. Mason Reed did not wake up one morning and decide to end his marriage. He arrived at that decision the way he had arrived at most things in his life, gradually, then, suddenly convinced it had always been inevitable. By the time he said the words out loud, he believed them. Not because they were entirely true, but because they were convenient. The days following Paula's quiet agreement unsettled him more than he expected. There had been no resistance, no attempt to negotiate, no emotional reaction he could point to and justify his decision against. Instead, there had been clarity. And clarity, Mason found, was harder to stand against than conflict. He spent more time away from the house, not because he needed distance, but because distance allowed him to maintain the version of events he preferred. With Chloe Bennett, everything felt simpler. She did not ask about hospital visits. She did not bring up bills. She did not carry the quiet weight that followed Paula from room to room. With Chloe, there was no past to account for. Only a present that felt lighter, easier, more aligned with the life Mason believed he deserved. "You're doing the right thing," Chloe said one evening, her voice soft but certain as they sat in the living room of the apartment he had helped secure for her. The space was modern, carefully furnished, designed to reflect a lifestyle Mason had not yet fully attained, but was trying to step into. "It's just been building for a long time," Mason replied, leaning back against the couch. "We're not the same people anymore." Chloe nodded as if she had always known that. "You've outgrown it," she said. "That kind of life. It holds people back." Mason exhaled the words, settling into something that felt like justification. Exactly. He did not mention Lily. Chloe did not ask. There were absences in their conversations that both of them chose not to notice, because noticing would complicate things. And Mason was no longer interested in complication. At the hospital, Paula Patterson moved through the day with the same steady precision. Lily's surgery had been scheduled, not immediately, but soon enough that every hour now carried a quiet urgency. Preoperative assessments filled their time. Tests, consultations, paperwork. Paula handled each step without hesitation. She asked the right questions. She made the necessary decisions. She ensured that nothing was overlooked. Mason was informed of the schedule. His response came hours later. "I'll try to be there." Paula read the message, then set the phone aside. She did not ask what try meant, because she already understood. That afternoon, Ethan Cole called again. "The board notices have been sent," he said. "The transition will be formalized within days." Paula listened. "Any internal resistance?" she asked. "Minimal," Ethan replied. Most of the stakeholders weren't in a position to challenge the structure. It was comprehensive. Paula expected nothing less. "And Mason's company?" she asked. There was a brief pause. "It's part of the acquisition chain," Ethan said. "Indirectly. But yes, it will be affected." Paula did not react outwardly. "Understood," she said. "Do you want to be present for the initial board meeting?" Ethan asked. Paula considered the question, not because she needed to, but because timing mattered. "Yes," she said. "Schedule it." "Done." Ethan replied, "I'll send the details." The call ended. Paula returned to Lily's room. Her daughter was awake, quietly drawing on a piece of paper the nurses had provided. "What are you making?" Paula asked, sitting beside her. "A house," Lily said, "with a big window." Paula looked at the drawing. The lines were uneven, the proportions imperfect, but the intention was clear. "Who lives there?" Paul asked. Lily thought for a moment. "Us," she said. "Just us." Paula nodded. "Then it's exactly right." Lily smiled. Mason met with his lawyer 2 days later. Mark Dalton's office was everything Mason had expected. Polished, controlled, designed to project authority. Mark himself was efficient, direct. He reviewed the documents with practiced ease. "Given your situation," he said, adjusting his glasses, "we can proceed with a standard filing." Irreconcilable differences. Financial strain. Nothing unusual. Mason nodded. "And the assets?" he asked. Mark glanced at the file. "Based on what you've provided, the division is straightforward," he said. "There's no significant independent wealth on her side that would complicate matters." Mason leaned back slightly, relieved. "And the child?" he asked. Mark's expression remained neutral. "Given her medical condition, primary custody will likely remain with your wife," he said. You can request visitation, but full custody would be difficult to justify. Mason hesitated, not out of attachment, but out of calculation. That's fine, he said. I don't want to disrupt her care. The phrasing was careful, measured. It sounded responsible. Mark nodded. Then we proceed, he said. I'll prepare the final documents. Mason signed the preliminary paperwork without reading every detail. Not because he trusted the system, but because he believed he understood it. That belief would remain unchallenged for now. Back at the hospital, Paula received the notification. Divorce filing prepared, awaiting signature. She opened the document, read it in full. Every clause, every assumption, every omission. Mason had presented a version of their life that was simplified, streamlined, convenient. Paula did not correct it. Not yet. Instead, she noted it. Then she closed the document. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Mason. We should finalize this soon. Paula typed a response. Yes, nothing more. Because nothing more was needed. The day the papers were delivered, the hospital corridor was unusually quiet. Lily had been taken in for another round of tests. Paula stood near the window, reviewing the schedule for the next week. Mason approached with a folder in hand. His expression was composed, almost detached. This is everything he said, extending the folder toward her. Paula took it, opened it, read the first page, then the second, then the third. She did not rush. Mason shifted, slightly uncomfortable with the silence. You can have your lawyer look at it, he said, but it's pretty standard. Paula looked up. I've already reviewed it, she said. Mason blinked. You already have it? Paula nodded. I received a copy earlier. Mason's grip tightened slightly on the edge of the folder. Right, he said. Okay. Another pause. Then, as if needing to fill the space, he added, This is the best way forward, for everyone. Paula held his gaze. For a moment there was an opportunity, not for confrontation, but for truth. She did not take it. Instead, she said, Then we should proceed. Mason nodded, relief flickering across his expression. He had expected resistance. He had prepared for it. And now, faced with its absence, he found himself moving forward more quickly than he had anticipated. Good, he said. Good. He handed her a pen. Paula took it. Not because she needed it, but because the gesture mattered to him. And in this moment, she allowed him that. Because what he believed he was finalizing was only the beginning of what would follow. The hospital corridor was too bright for what was about to happen. White light stretched across polished floors, reflecting the quiet movements of nurses and the distant hum of machines that never stopped working no matter what decisions were made within their reach. Lily had been taken in less than 20 minutes earlier. Preoperative preparation, final assessments, the kind of procedures that required signatures, approvals, and a steady presence from someone who would not hesitate when it mattered. Paula Patterson had signed every document placed in front of her without delay. Every form, every authorization, every risk acknowledgement. Her handwriting remained consistent, unshaken. Mason Reed arrived just as the last set of papers was being cleared, not early enough to be necessary, not late enough to be absent. He walked down the corridor with measured steps. A folder held firmly in his hand, his expression composed in a way that suggested he had already resolved everything internally. Dr. Harris stood nearby reviewing a chart. Nina Cole adjusted a tray of instruments at the nurses' station. Two other families waited further down the hall, their conversations quiet, their attention drawn subtly but inevitably toward the space where something heavier than routine was unfolding. Mason stopped in front of Paula. This won't take long, he said. Paula looked at him, not searching, not questioning, simply present. Mason opened the folder, removed the documents, Divorce papers, finalized, prepared, structured to conclude something that in his mind had already ended. I had everything reviewed, he continued. It's straightforward. Paula took the papers. Her eyes moved across the first page, then the second. She did not skim. She read. Because reading for Paula was not about understanding what was written. It was about understanding what had been left out. Mason shifted his weight slightly. The silence unsettled him more than he expected. You don't have to do this here, he added. We can finalize it later. Paula turned the page. There's no reason to delay, she said. Her voice was calm, even, unchanged. Dr. Harris glanced up briefly, then back down at his chart. Nina's movements slowed. No one intervened, but no one looked away either. There are moments that announce themselves without sound. This was one of them. Mason exhaled, as if relieved to be moving forward. I think this is the best decision, he said, for both of us. Paula did not respond, because agreement in this case did not require repetition. She reached the final page, the signature line, her name already printed beneath it, waiting. Mason handed her a pen, a simple object, light, ordinary. Paula took it, not because she needed it, but because he expected her to. She positioned the paper against the flat surface of a nearby counter. Steady, unhurried. And then she signed. No hesitation, no pause. Just a single continuous motion. Paula Patterson. The ink settled into the page. Permanent. Mason watched her finish, something like relief passing through his expression. It was done. That was what he believed. That's it, he said quietly. Paula placed the pen down, closed the folder, and handed it back to him. Yes, she said. One word, without weight, without resistance, but not without meaning. Mason took the folder. For a moment he lingered, as if expecting something more. A question, a reaction, an attempt to revisit what had just been finalized. Paula gave him none of it, because there was nothing left to clarify. A nurse stepped forward. We're ready to bring you in, Nina said gently. Paula nodded. I'll be there. Mason hesitated. Let me know how it goes, he said. The words sounded appropriate, expected. They carried the shape of concern, but not the substance. Paula met his gaze. I will. She did not ask him to stay. He did not offer. And that was the quiet truth of everything that had just happened. Mason adjusted his grip on the folder, then turned. His steps were firm, decisive. He moved down the corridor without looking back, the distance between him and the hospital room increasing with each step. Behind him, the automatic glass doors slid open, then began to close. Paula watched him go, not with regret, not with anger, but with clarity, because some departures do not create absence. They reveal it. Her phone vibrated. A small, precise interruption. Paula glanced down. An email. The subject line was short, unambiguous. Final confirmation, contract approved. Below it, the number. $36. 000000000. Paula opened the message. Read it once, then closed it. No visible reaction. No shift in expression. Just acknowledgement. Because the timing was not accidental, and the outcome was not unexpected. In the operating room beyond the doors, Lily waited. Machines ready, doctors prepared. A future still uncertain, but now supported by something far more stable than hope. Paula slipped her phone into her pocket, then turned away from the corridor, toward the room, toward her daughter. Because that was where her presence mattered, not in what had just ended, but in what was about to begin. Behind her, the doors closed completely, and with them the version of her life Mason Reed believed he had left behind. What he did not understand What he had never taken the time to see was that he had not walked away from a burden. He had walked away from the only structure that had ever been holding everything together. Paula did not need to tell him that. She did not need to explain, because explanations belong to those who seek understanding, and Mason had already chosen not to. The corridor returned to its quiet rhythm. Footsteps, voices, the distant hum of machines. Nothing appeared different. And yet everything had changed. Paula Patterson did not look back. She stepped forward, and the future already set in motion long before this moment moved with her. The first night after the surgery was the longest, not because of complications, but because of waiting. Lily lay in recovery, small beneath layers of monitored care, her body still adjusting to what had been done to save it. Machines traced her heartbeat in steady rhythms, each sound a quiet confirmation that the procedure had gone as planned. Dr. Harris had delivered the update with cautious optimism. The surgery was successful, he said, but the next 48 hours are critical. We'll be monitoring closely. Paula Patterson had listened without interruption. She asked the necessary questions. Recovery timeline, risk factors, immediate indicators to watch. Dr. Harris answered each one, then left her with the kind of silence that follows information too important to be repeated. Mason did not return. There was no call, no message asking for details beyond the single text he had sent earlier that day. Let me know how it goes. Paula had not replied, not because she intended to withhold information, but because there was nothing in his absence that suggested he was waiting for it. So she remained, seated beside Lily's bed, watching, not anxiously, but attentively, because attention in moments like this was the only form of control that mattered. Hours passed. Nurses moved in and out of the room with practiced efficiency, adjusting monitors, checking vitals, documenting everything. Paula observed each action, not interfering, but understanding. At some point in the quiet space between midnight and morning, her phone vibrated. She stepped into the hallway before answering. Ethan Cole's voice came through steady as always. I wanted to confirm you received the final notice, he said. I did, Paula replied. Everything is now active. Ethan continued. The transition is complete across all primary entities. Board restructuring has begun. Paula leaned slightly against the wall, her gaze fixed ahead. Timeline, she asked. Initial changes will be internal, Ethan said. Operational shifts within a week. External impact will follow shortly after. Paula nodded. And Mason's company, a brief pause. It's within the affected network, Ethan said. The acquisition places it under new oversight. Changes are inevitable. Paula absorbed that, not with satisfaction, but with recognition. Keep me updated, she said. Of course. The call ended. Paula stood there for a moment longer, not thinking, not reconsidering, simply allowing the alignment of events to settle into place. Then she returned to Lily's room. By morning, the hospital had resumed its usual rhythm, controlled movement, measured urgency, life continuing in structured patterns that did not pause for individual outcomes. Lily's condition remained stable, not fully awake yet, but responding. Paula sat beside her, her hand resting lightly against the blanket. Mom. The voice was faint, but clear. Paula leaned closer. I'm here. Lily's eyes opened slowly, confused at first, then focused. Did it work, she asked. Paula smiled soft but certain. Yes. Lily's lips curved slightly. Then she closed her eyes again, drifting back into rest. Paula remained where she was, because presence in that moment was everything. Across the city, Mason Reed woke in a different environment. The apartment he now spent most of his time in was quiet, orderly, designed to reflect a life that did not include hospital visits or late-night concerns. Chloe Bennett moved through the space with ease, her presence already integrated into what Mason had begun to see as his new normal. "You're up early," she said, glancing at him from the kitchen. "Work," Mason replied, reaching for his phone. He checked his messages. Nothing from Paula, nothing about Lily. He paused, not out of concern, but out of habit. Then he set the phone down. "She's got it handled," he said, more to himself than to Chloe. Chloe nodded, uninterested in details that did not directly affect her. "Of course she does," she said. Mason accepted that, because it aligned with what he needed to believe. Paula was discharged from the hospital with Lily 2 days later, not fully recovered, but stable enough to continue care at home. The house they returned to felt unchanged, but quieter, not because something was missing, but because something had already been removed. Mason's presence had been reduced to absence long before he physically left. Now it was simply visible. Paula moved through the space with purpose. Medications were organized, schedules adjusted, follow-up appointments confirmed. Everything aligned around Lily's recovery. There was no disruption, no confusion, just structure. That evening, Paula received another call from Rachel Stein. "The initial reports are coming in," Rachel said. "The market is responding as expected. There's movement in several sectors." Paula listened. "Any irregularities?" she asked. "None," Rachel replied. "The structure is holding. Control remains stable." Paula nodded. "And internal responses mixed," Rachel said. "Some resistance, but nothing significant. Most don't yet understand the full scope." Paula expected that. "They will," she said. Eventually, Rachel agreed. The call ended. Paula set the phone down and looked toward the living room. Lily sat on the couch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her attention focused on a quiet cartoon playing on the screen. There was no sign of fear, no visible memory of the operating room, only the steady resilience that had carried her this far. Paula watched her for a moment, then returned to her work. 3 days later, Mason noticed the first change. It came in the form of an email. Subject line: organizational update. Mandatory meeting. He opened it without concern. At first. Then he read further. The language was formal, structured, but the implications were clear. There had been an acquisition, not announced publicly, not widely discussed, but effective, immediate. All departments were to attend a briefing. Mason frowned slightly. "Something going on?" Chloe asked, glancing up from her phone. "Just corporate stuff," Mason replied. "Probably restructuring." Chloe shrugged. "Does it affect you?" Mason hesitated, then shook his head. Not really. He believed that, because from his perspective, his position had always been stable, defined, secure. He did not yet understand that structures could shift without warning, that control could change hands without announcement, that decisions made far beyond his visibility could alter the trajectory of his life without ever mentioning his name. Paula Patterson understood that, because she had built it that way. That night, as Lily slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, Paula sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open, not for work, but for review. Everything was progressing, exactly as expected. Her phone buzzed once more. An internal notification. Board meeting confirmed. Attendance required. Paula read it, then closed the laptop. She did not need to prepare. Preparation had already been completed long before this moment. Now it was simply a matter of presence, of timing, of allowing what had been set in motion to reveal itself. Paula stood, turned off the light, and walked quietly down the hallway. Because while one part of her life was moving toward its inevitable conclusion, another had already begun. Control, when it shifts, does not announce itself. It settles quietly into place. altering structures from within, leaving surfaces intact while everything beneath them rearranges. Paula Patterson understood this better than most. It was the principle her entire professional life had been built upon. And now, it was the principle guiding everything that followed. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning. Location: a glass-walled executive floor in downtown Chicago. Time: 9:00 a.m. Mandatory attendance. Paula arrived early. Not because she needed preparation, but because she preferred observation before participation. The building itself reflected the kind of authority that did not rely on noise. Polished stone floors controlled lighting, quiet security presence. Everything designed to project stability even when change was imminent. Paula moved through it without hesitation. She wore nothing that drew attention. A tailored suit in neutral tones, minimal accessories. No visible indication of the position she held, because visibility was not her objective, not yet. Ethan Cole met her near the conference room. "You're right on time," he said, his tone professional but acknowledging the weight of the moment. Paula nodded. "Status?" she asked. "Everything is aligned," Ethan replied. "The board has been informed of a structural transition. They don't yet know the full extent." Paula expected that. "And disclosure?" "At your discretion," Ethan said. Paula considered that for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Not yet." Ethan understood immediately. They entered the conference room together. Mason Reed arrived 5 minutes before the meeting began, late enough to avoid waiting, early enough to appear punctual. He moved through the space with the quiet confidence of someone who believed he understood the environment he was in. His position in the company had been stable for years, not exceptional, but secure. He greeted a few colleagues, took his usual seat, opened his laptop. Nothing in the room suggested anything unusual. That in itself was unusual. The executives at the front of the room spoke in low voices. Legal representatives were present, more than usual. Mason noticed that, but dismissed it. Corporate adjustments happened. Restructuring, reallocation. It was part of the system, and he had always been part of the system. The meeting began precisely at 9:00. A senior board member stood, cleared his throat, and addressed the room. "Thank you all for attending on short notice," he said. "As you are aware, the company has undergone a recent acquisition." The words settled into the room, not heavily, but noticeably. Mason's attention sharpened slightly. He leaned back, listening. The acquisition was executed through a multi-layered holding structure, the board member continued. Effective, immediately operational oversight will transition to the new controlling entity. Murmurs subtle but present. Mason exchanged a glance with a colleague. "What does that mean?" the colleague whispered. "Probably just leadership changes," Mason replied quietly. He believed that, because he needed the situation to remain within the boundaries he understood. At the far end of the room, Paula sat quietly, observing, not speaking, not introducing herself. Because this moment was not about presence, it was about progression. Ethan remained beside her, equally composed. The board member continued. "Further details regarding structural changes will be provided as they are finalized," he said. "For now, all departments are expected to maintain standard operations." Questions followed, measured, cautious, most focused on immediate impact. Job security, reporting lines. Mason listened. He did not ask anything, because nothing so far suggested that his position was directly affected. That assumption would not hold. After the meeting concluded, smaller discussions formed throughout the room. Clusters of conversation, speculation, uncertainty. Mason closed his laptop, stood, and moved toward a group of colleagues. "Any idea who's behind it?" someone asked. "Probably a private equity group," another replied. They've been active lately. Mason nodded slightly. That makes sense, he said. Because it did, from his perspective. Paula remained seated, watching, not engaging. Ethan leaned slightly toward her. Next phase begins this afternoon, he said quietly. Executive disclosures, department-level adjustments. Paula nodded. And Mason's division? She asked. Impacted, Ethan said. Review scheduled. Paula absorbed that. Not with satisfaction, not with hesitation, just acknowledgement. Proceed as planned, she said. Ethan nodded. Back at the apartment, Chloe Bennett scrolled through her phone, her attention divided between social updates and financial notifications. Mason entered later that day, his expression thoughtful but not concerned. Something going on at work? Chloe asked without looking up. Acquisition. Mason replied, dropping his keys onto the counter. Chloe glanced at him. That good or bad? Mason shrugged. Depends, he said. But it shouldn't affect me. Chloe nodded, accepting the answer, because like Mason, she operated within assumptions that had not yet been challenged. That evening, Paula returned home. Lily sat at the kitchen table coloring quietly. How was your meeting? She asked, looking up. Paula placed her bag down. It went as expected, she said. Lily smiled. Do you always know what to expect? Paula considered the question, then answered simply, I prepare for it. Lily nodded, satisfied with that. Paula moved through the kitchen, her action steady, her focus clear. Nothing about her demeanor suggested that anything significant had changed. And yet, everything had. Later that night, Paula reviewed the next set of documents. Executive restructuring plans, departmental audits, financial reviews, each aligned with the structure she had authorized, each moving forward with precision. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. Initial disclosures complete. Reactions contained. Paula read it, then set the phone aside. Contained reactions were expected, for now. Because understanding takes time, and realization comes later. Mason checked his email before going to bed. Another message. Department review. Attendance required. He frowned slightly. More meetings, more adjustments. Still nothing that suggested instability. Not yet. He closed the email, set the phone down, and turned off the light. Across the city, Paula did the same, but for different reasons. She was not waiting for information. She was allowing it to unfold. Because control, once established, does not need to announce itself. It simply exists, and everything else adjusts around it. The first signs of instability did not arrive as a crisis. They appeared as adjustments, small, procedural, easy to dismiss if viewed in isolation. Mason Reed recognized them but did not yet understand them. That misunderstanding would not last. The department review was scheduled for Monday morning. Mandatory attendance, no additional context. Mason entered the conference room with the same measured confidence he had carried into the previous meeting. The environment was familiar, the faces around him unchanged. But something in the atmosphere had shifted, not visibly, but perceptibly. There were fewer conversations, more silence. People checked their phones more often, as if expecting information that had not yet arrived. Mason took his seat, opened his laptop, waited. At precisely 9:00, the door closed. Two individuals entered, not part of the usual leadership team. Legal. That much was immediately clear. Their presence altered the tone of the room without a word being spoken. One of them, a woman in her early 40s with a calm, controlled demeanor, stepped forward. Thank you for attending, she said. We'll begin with a brief overview of the restructuring process. Mason listened, still calm, still certain that whatever changes were coming would remain at a level above his. Effective. Immediately, she continued, all departments will undergo financial and operational review. This includes assessment of expenditure patterns, asset allocation, and compliance with internal policy. Mason's attention sharpened, not out of concern, but out of recognition. This was more detailed than standard restructuring. Still, it was manageable. Routine even. Individual meetings will be scheduled as necessary, she added. You will be notified directly if your participation is required. The phrase settled into the room. Subtle, but precise. If your participation is required. Mason leaned back slightly, still unconcerned. Because from his perspective, there was no reason for his participation to be required. Across the city, Paula Patterson received the same update in a different form. A structured report, clear, concise, aligned with the plan she had authorized. She reviewed it without urgency, because urgency implied uncertainty, and there was none. Her phone rang. Rachel Stein. The audits are progressing, Rachel said. We're starting to see irregularities. Paula listened. Scope, she asked. Mid-level management, primarily, Rachel replied. Expense allocations that don't align with policy. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to justify deeper review. Paula nodded. And documentation? Comprehensive, Rachel said. We have everything we need. Paula expected that. Proceed, she said. Of course. The call ended. Paula set the phone down, then turned her attention back to Lily, because that remained her priority. Everything else moved in parallel. Mason's meeting ended without incident. No names called. No immediate changes announced. He left the room with the same quiet confidence he had entered with. That confidence held for a few more hours. The email arrived just after lunch. Subject line, individual review. Required attendance. Mason opened it, read it once. Then again. The language was formal, neutral, but direct. His attendance was required. Time 3:00 p.m. Location conference room B. He frowned slightly. Everything okay? A colleague asked from across the desk. Yeah, Mason replied. Just a review. The colleague nodded. Everyone's getting those, he said. Mason accepted that, because it made sense, because it aligned with the assumption that nothing about his situation was unique. At 3:00 p.m., Mason entered conference room B. The same two legal representatives were present, along with a third individual, a financial analyst. The room felt smaller than it should have, not physically, but structurally. Mr. Reed, the woman from earlier, said. Thank you for coming. Mason nodded. Took a seat, of course. A file was placed in front of him. Not thick, but substantial. We're conducting a standard review of departmental expenditures, she continued. Your role involves oversight of certain financial activities. We'd like to clarify a few items. Mason leaned forward slightly, still composed. Sure, he said. The analyst opened the file, turned it toward him. Over the past 3 months, he said, there have been a series of transactions linked to your authorization. Mason glanced down, recognized the numbers, the dates, familiar, but out of context. These were personal expenses, Mason said quickly, covered outside company operations. The analyst nodded. We understand, he said. However, the funds originated from accounts associated with your role. Mason's expression shifted, slightly, almost imperceptibly. That's not accurate, he said. The analyst slid another document forward. Transaction records, he said, cross-referenced with account access logs. Mason looked at them, this time more carefully. The alignment was clear, too clear. He sat back. This is a mistake, he said. The woman met his gaze. We're not making any conclusions at this stage, she said. We're asking for clarification. Clarification. The word felt controlled, neutral, but it carried weight. Mason exhaled slowly. "I'll need to review this," he said. "Of course," she replied. "We'll provide copies." The meeting concluded shortly after. No accusations, no immediate consequences, but the structure had shifted, and Mason felt it. That evening, Chloe noticed the change. "You're quiet," she said, watching him from across the room. "Just work," Mason replied. Chloe tilted her head slightly. Still the acquisition thing. Mason nodded. "Yeah, just adjustments." He did not mention the review, because mentioning it would require acknowledging it, and he was not ready to do that. Paula, meanwhile, reviewed the same data from a different position, not as a participant, but as the authority behind the process. The records were precise, comprehensive. Every transfer, every allocation, every decision Mason had made with money that was no longer under his control. Paula did not react, because reaction was unnecessary. The information spoke for itself. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. Initial findings confirmed. Proceeding to next phase. Paula read it, then set the phone aside, because the next phase was inevitable. Not because she intended it, but because the structure required it. Mason checked his email again before bed. Another message. Follow-up review. Attendance required. His jaw tightened slightly. 2 meetings, back to back. That was no longer routine. He set the phone down, looked across the room at Chloe. She smiled faintly, unaware, unaffected, for now. Mason leaned back, exhaled, and for the first time, a thought entered his mind that did not align with his previous certainty. Something had changed. He did not yet know what. But he could feel it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to recognize that the structure he had relied on was no longer as stable as he believed. Across the city, Paula turned off the light in Lily's room. Her daughter slept peacefully, recovery progressing, stable. Paula stood for a moment, then stepped out, closing the door quietly behind her. Because while one part of her life was healing, another was beginning to reveal the consequences of choices made long before this moment. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with precision. And once precision is set in motion, it does not stop. By the time the second review was scheduled, Mason Reed no longer dismissed it as routine. Not entirely. The first meeting had left something behind. Not a clear accusation, not even a direct warning, but a shift in tone, a narrowing of space, the kind that made it harder to move without noticing the boundaries. He arrived 10 minutes early this time, not out of discipline, out of anticipation. Conference room B looked the same. Same table, same chairs, same controlled lighting. But Mason noticed details he had overlooked before. The placement of documents, the way the chairs were aligned, the absence of anything unnecessary. It was a room designed for clarity. And clarity, Mason was beginning to understand, could be uncomfortable. The same 3 individuals were present: the legal representative, the analyst, and a new addition, a senior compliance officer, older, more deliberate in his movements. Mason took his seat. No small talk this time. No attempt to ease into the conversation. "Mr. Reed," the woman began, her tone unchanged. "Thank you for returning." Mason nodded. Of course. A file was placed in front of him again. Thicker this time, more structured. "We've completed an initial review of the transactions discussed previously," she continued. "We'd like to walk through a few clarifications." Mason leaned forward, focused, prepared, or at least he believed he was. The analyst opened the file, turned a page, then another. "Over the past 90 days, he said, we've identified a pattern of fund allocation that falls outside standard operational parameters." Mason's jaw tightened slightly. "We went over this," he said. "Those were personal expenses." The compliance officer spoke for the first time. "Fund origin matters," he said, "not just classification." The statement was simple, but precise. Mason looked at him. "This is being taken out of context," he said. The analyst slid another document forward. "This is the context," he replied. Mason looked down. Detailed breakdowns, dates, amounts, destinations, cross-referenced with access logs. There was no ambiguity. Everything aligned. Too cleanly, too completely. "This doesn't account for reimbursements," Mason said, his tone controlled, but firmer now. The woman nodded. "We've accounted for all documented reimbursements," she said. "The remaining discrepancies are what we're discussing." Discrepancies. The word landed differently this time, less neutral, more defined. Mason leaned back, exhaled slowly. "What exactly are you implying?" he asked. The compliance officer met his gaze. "We're not implying anything," he said. "We're identifying inconsistencies that require explanation." Explanation. Not accusation. Not yet. But closer. Mason's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table. "I'll need time to review this," he said. "You'll have access to all documentation," the woman replied. "We'll schedule a follow-up." The meeting ended shortly after. No resolution, no conclusion. But the structure had tightened, and Mason felt it. Outside the building, the air felt different. Not colder, not heavier, just less certain. Mason stood for a moment looking out at the city. He had always understood his position in clear terms. Defined, stable. Now those definitions were shifting, not visibly, but undeniably. He reached for his phone, opened his messages, scrolled, then stopped. Paula's name sat there, unchanged, unmoved. He considered texting her, not about the review, not directly, just something. He didn't, because there was nothing he could say that would fit into the version of events he had already set in motion. So he put the phone away and walked toward the car. At the apartment, Chloe noticed the difference immediately. Not in what Mason said, but in what he didn't. "You've got that look again," she said, watching him from the kitchen. Mason paused. "What look?" "The one where you're thinking too much," she replied. Mason exhaled. "It's just work," he said. Chloe leaned against the counter. "That thing again," Mason nodded. "Yeah, just restructuring stuff." Chloe studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "They always make it sound worse than it is," she said. "You'll be fine." Mason wanted to believe that, because believing it meant he didn't have to question anything further. "Yeah," he said. "I will." Chloe smiled, satisfied with the answer, because her interest in the situation extended only as far as its impact. And so far, nothing had changed. Not visibly. Across the city, Paula Patterson reviewed the same developments from a different perspective. Her office remained quiet, unremarkable. No indication of the scale of influence moving through it. Her laptop displayed the audit summary. Clean, structured, each discrepancy identified, each step documented. Paula read through it once, then closed the file, because the information was not new, only confirmed. Her phone rang. "Ethan, we're moving to formal action," he said. Paula listened. "Timeline?" she asked. "Within the week," Ethan replied. "Internal resolution first. External disclosure only if necessary." Paula nodded. "And resistance, minimal," Ethan said. "The documentation is comprehensive." Paula expected that. "Proceed," she said. There was a brief pause. Then Ethan added, "You should be present for the final review." Paula considered that, not because she needed to decide, but because presence in this case carried meaning. "Yes," she said. "I'll arrange it," Ethan replied. The call ended. Paula set the phone down, then looked toward the living room. Lily sat on the couch, her movements slower but stronger than before. Recovery was not immediate, but it was real. Paula watched her for a moment, then returned to her work, because both paths required attention. Mason's next email arrived that evening. Subject line, "Final review, mandatory attendance." No ambiguity this time, no neutral language, final. Mason read it twice, then set the phone down. This was no longer routine, not even close. He looked around the apartment, at the space, at Chloe, at the life he had begun to step into. Everything still appeared intact, unchanged, but appearances he was beginning to understand could be misleading. "Another meeting?" Chloe asked. Mason nodded. "Yeah, same thing." That Mason hesitated, then said, "I don't know." Chloe frowned slightly. "Well, figure it out," she said. "That's what you're good at, right?" The statement was meant to reassure. It didn't, because for the first time, Mason wasn't sure he was in a position to figure anything out. That night, sleep came slower. Not because of fear, but because of uncertainty. And uncertainty, unlike fear, doesn't announce itself clearly. It lingers. Quiet, persistent. Mason lay awake longer than usual, thinking, replaying, trying to align what he knew with what he was starting to suspect. The two did not match. Across the city, Paula turned off the light in Lily's room. Her daughter slept peacefully, steady, recovering. Paula stood for a moment, then stepped back into the hallway. Because while one part of her life was stabilizing, another was reaching its conclusion, not abruptly, not dramatically, but exactly as it had been designed to. By the time Mason Reed stepped into the final review meeting, the structure surrounding him had already closed in with a precision he could not fully comprehend, and yet he could feel it in the way the room held its silence before anyone spoke, in the way the documents were arranged with deliberate order, and in the absence of anything that might soften what was about to unfold. The conference room was larger than the previous one, positioned on an executive floor that Mason had never needed to access before, and that alone should have been enough to signal that this was no longer a routine matter of internal clarification, but rather a culmination of something that had been building long before he was invited to witness it. He arrived exactly on time, neither early nor late, holding himself with a controlled composure that now required effort rather than coming naturally. And when he entered, he immediately noticed that the composition of the room had changed. Ethan Cole was present. Mason did not know him personally, but he recognized the type immediately, someone whose authority did not rely on volume or display, but on the quiet certainty of someone who operated at a level where decisions were executed rather than debated. Beside him sat Rachel Stein. Reviewing a series of documents with focused attention, her posture relaxed yet precise, while the legal representatives from previous meetings remained in place, forming a structure that felt less like a discussion and more like a conclusion waiting to be stated. Mason took his seat slowly, aware that every movement now felt observed, even if no one appeared to be watching directly. "Mr. Reed Ethan," began, his tone measured, "and even thank you for attending. This will be a formal review of the financial discrepancies identified in prior sessions, and we will proceed with documentation for clarity rather than interpretation." The phrasing was deliberate, removing any suggestion that this meeting was open-ended. Mason nodded once, keeping his expression controlled, though the tension beneath it had begun to surface in ways he could no longer entirely conceal. "I understand," he said. Rachel turned a page and slid a document toward him, not abruptly, but with the kind of precision that suggested everything had already been verified. "What you're looking at," she said, "is a consolidated report of all transactions authorized under your access credentials over the past quarter, cross-referenced with personal account activity and external transfers. Mason leaned forward, his eyes scanning the pages, and this time, there was no attempt to dismiss what he saw as incomplete or misaligned. Because the clarity was absolute, every figure supported by timestamps, every transfer connected through a chain that left no gaps for reinterpretation. These funds, he said carefully, were personal in nature, and I intended to reconcile them. Ethan did not interrupt him immediately, allowing the statement to settle before responding. Intent does not alter origin, he said, his voice calm but precise. An origin in this case is what defines the classification of these transactions. Mason sat back slightly, his fingers tightening against the edge of the table as he processed the shift from clarification to definition, recognizing that the language itself had moved beyond neutral territory. This is being escalated unnecessarily, he said, though the certainty he attempted to project no longer carried the same weight it once had. Rachel met his gaze briefly before continuing. The escalation is procedural, not personal, she said. However, the scale and pattern of these transactions require formal resolution. Mason exhaled slowly, his mind working to reconstruct a framework in which he still held control over the situation, but that framework was beginning to fragment under the weight of documentation that did not rely on interpretation. What happens now, he asked. Ethan folded his hands on the table, his posture unchanged. Now, he said, we move to final disclosure and resolution. There was a pause then, not for dramatic effect, but because timing mattered. And in that pause, something else shifted within the room. The door opened. Not abruptly, not forcefully, but with quiet intention. Mason turned, his attention drawn not by the sound, but by the presence that entered. Paula Patterson stepped inside. There was nothing in her appearance that demanded attention, no visible display of status or authority. And yet the room adjusted to her presence in a way that Mason could not immediately explain, as if every structure within it had already accounted for her arrival long before it occurred. She did not rush. She did not look at Mason immediately. Instead, she took her place at the table beside Ethan. Her posture composed, her expression neutral, and when she finally lifted her gaze, it was not searching or confrontational. It was simply steady. Mason's reaction was not immediate. For a moment, his mind attempted to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed to be true, and when that reconciliation failed, something deeper surfaced, something closer to recognition than confusion. Paula, he said, the word coming out quieter than he intended. No one else in the room reacted, because for them this was not new information. It was confirmation. Paula inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his presence without engaging with the tone behind it. Mr. Reed, Ethan continued, as if the interruption had been part of the structure all along. This review is being conducted under the authority of the controlling entity overseeing this acquisition. Mason's gaze shifted between them, his understanding beginning to fracture in a way that could no longer be contained by assumption. What does that have to do with? He began, but the sentence did not complete because the answer had already formed before it could be spoken. Rachel turned another document toward him. This is the ownership structure, she said. Mason looked down. And this time, the clarity was not financial, it was structural. Entities layered within entities. Control distributed across names that did not appear familiar at first glance until the pattern revealed itself. And at the center of that pattern, not prominently displayed but unmistakably positioned, was Paula. Not as a participant, not as an employee, but as the authority behind the structure itself. Mason's breath slowed, not out of calm, but out of the effort required to process something that no longer aligned with any version of reality he had constructed. This isn't, he began, but the words did not resolve into anything coherent. Paula did not interrupt. She did not explain, because explanation was not required. Everything that needed to be understood was already present. Ethan spoke again, his tone unchanged. The acquisition that has placed this company under new control, he said, was executed through a structure designed and authorized by Miss Patterson. The room remained silent, not because of shock, but because the moment did not require reaction. It required recognition. Mason looked at Paula, really looked at her. And for the first time, he saw not what he had assumed, not the version of her that fit within the boundaries he had created, but the reality that had existed all along, unnoticed, unacknowledged, and now undeniable. "You knew," he said, though the statement lacked direction. Paula held his gaze. "I observed," she replied. The distinction mattered more than anything else that had been said. Mason leaned back slowly, the weight of realization settling in. Not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual understanding that every decision he had made had been operating within a structure he did not see, and that structure had never depended on him. Around the table, the documents remained in place, the evidence unchanged, the outcome already determined. No one raised their voice, no one pressed further, because nothing needed to be forced. The truth once visible required no reinforcement. Paula did not continue speaking. She did not present accusations. She did not revisit the past, because the past had already led to this point without her needing to direct it. And Mason, sitting there within a system he no longer understood, realized something with a clarity that arrived too late to be useful. He had not stepped away from something that was holding him back. He had stepped away from the only structure that had ever been holding him up. Paula rose from her seat. Not abruptly, not with finality, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had nothing left to resolve within that space. The meeting would continue. Processes would be followed. Consequences would unfold. But her part in it, in that room, was already complete. She did not look back as she walked toward the door, because everything that needed to be seen had already been revealed. The room did not erupt after Paula Patterson walked out. There were no raised voices, no sudden reactions that might have matched the scale of what had just been revealed. Instead, the silence deepened, not as an absence of sound, but as a presence that pressed inward, forcing everything within it to settle into place. Mason Reed remained seated. He did not follow her. He did not speak, because movement in that moment would have required a direction, and for the first time in a long while, he no longer had one. Ethan Cole remained where he was. His posture unchanged, his attention returning not to Mason as a person, but to the process that had not been interrupted, only clarified. "We will proceed." Ethan said, his voice even as though the moment that had just unfolded had been anticipated down to its exact timing. Rachel Stein adjusted the documents slightly, aligning them with quiet precision before continuing. "The discrepancies we've outlined remain subject to formal resolution," she said. "Your cooperation at this stage will determine the outcome." Mason heard the words, but they did not immediately register in the way they would have before. His attention lingered elsewhere, fixed not on the documents in front of him, but on the realization that had begun to take shape and had not yet finished settling. Paula, not as his wife, not as someone he had already placed in the past, but as the architect of the very structure now determining what would happen next. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting against the table, grounding himself in something tangible. "What happens if I don't cooperate?" he asked, his voice steady, though the question carried more weight than he intended. Ethan met his gaze. "Then the process proceeds without your input," he said. "The outcome will be based entirely on documented evidence. No threat, no emphasis, just fact." Mason exhaled slowly, the air leaving him with a heaviness that had nothing to do with the room itself. He looked down at the documents again, this time not searching for inconsistencies, but recognizing the absence of any. Every transaction, every transfer, every decision he had made with the assumption that he controlled the narrative. They were all there, complete, contextualized, unavoidable. "I'll review everything," he said. Rachel nodded once. "You'll have access to full copies," she replied. We'll schedule a final resolution meeting once your review is complete. The meeting ended shortly after. No conclusion was declared, because the conclusion no longer required declaration. It had already been formed. Outside the building, the city continued as it always did. People moved with purpose. Traffic flowed in predictable patterns. Nothing in the external world reflected what had just shifted internally. Mason stood at the base of the building for longer than he intended. Not because he was uncertain of where to go, but because the place he had been moving toward no longer felt aligned with anything that made sense. He reached for his phone, opened it, scrolled, stopped. Paula's name was still there, unchanged, as if nothing had happened, as if everything had. He considered calling her, not to argue, not to explain, but to understand. The thought passed, not because he chose against it, but because he recognized with a clarity that had arrived too late. That understanding was no longer something he could request. It was something he had already chosen to ignore. So he put the phone away and walked. At the apartment, Chloe Bennett noticed the shift immediately. Not in Mason's words, but in the absence of them. "You're back early," she said, her tone casual, though her eyes lingered on him a moment longer than usual. Mason nodded. "Yeah." He moved through the space without his usual ease. His attention divided in a way that Chloe could not fully read, but could not ignore either. "What happened?" she asked. Mason paused. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because none of the answers he had fit within the version of his life that Chloe understood. "It's just work," he said finally. Chloe studied him. "That's not how you say, just work," she replied. Mason exhaled. "There's a review," he said. "Some financial stuff." Chloe straightened slightly. "Is that a problem?" The question was direct, focused. Mason hesitated, then said, "I don't know." That was the first time he had said it out loud. And the moment the words existed beyond his own thoughts, they carried weight he could not immediately dismiss. Chloe's expression shifted. Subtle, but noticeable. "Well," she said, her tone adjusting slightly, "you'll figure it out." Mason nodded. But the certainty that once followed that assumption was no longer there. Across the city, Paula Patterson moved through her evening with the same quiet structure that had defined everything she had done up to this point. Lily sat at the table, her recovery visible not in dramatic change, but in small, steady improvements. She held a glass of water with both hands, her movements careful but stronger than before. "Mom," she said, looking up, "when do I go back to school?" Paula considered the question. "Soon," she said. "When your body is ready." Lily nodded, satisfied, because trust for her had never required explanation. Paula watched her for a moment longer, then turned back to her work. Her phone vibrated. A message from Ethan. "Final phase initiated. Awaiting your presence for closure." Paula read it, then placed the phone down. Closure. The word carried meaning, but not in the way most people understood it. For Paula, closure was not about resolution. It was about completion. And completion did not require emotion. It required accuracy. Mason did not sleep well that night, not because of fear, but because of alignment. The version of events he had constructed, the assumptions he had relied on, the certainty he had carried without question, they no longer aligned with what he now knew to be true. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, his thoughts moving in patterns that did not resolve. Paula had never argued, never confronted him, never attempted to stop what he had been doing. And now he understood why. Not because she had accepted it, but because she had already moved beyond it. The realization settled slowly, not as a single moment, but as a sequence, each piece connecting to the next, until the structure was clear, and irreversible. The next morning, Mason arrived at work earlier than usual, not out of discipline, but because remaining still no longer felt possible. His desk was the same, his office unchanged, but the space felt different, not because it had shifted, but because his position within it had. An email waited. Final resolution meeting, attendance confirmed, time. Location, no additional detail. Mason read it, then closed his eyes briefly, not in avoidance, but in acknowledgement, because whatever came next would not be something he could adjust, redirect, or reinterpret. It would be something he would have to face. Paula prepared without visible preparation. Her documents were already in order, her position already established. There was nothing left to arrange, only to attend. Before leaving, she paused at Lily's room. Her daughter looked up from her book. "Will you be back soon?" she asked. Paula stepped inside. "Yes," she said. Lily smiled. "Okay." Paula held that moment for a second longer than necessary, then turned and left. Because while some things required presence, others required completion. And this was one of them. The final meeting did not feel like a confrontation. There were no raised voices waiting behind the closed door. No visible tension that suggested something explosive was about to happen. Instead, everything about the room reflected the same controlled precision that had guided every step leading to this moment. Mason Reed arrived early again. Not because he expected to change anything, but because arriving late would have implied a lack of awareness he could no longer afford. The conference room was smaller this time, more contained, designed for resolution rather than discussion. Ethan Cole was already seated. Rachel Stein beside him, the legal representatives in place, and Paula Patterson. She sat at the far end of the table, her posture composed, her attention focused not on Mason, but on the documents in front of her. There was no tension in her expression, no visible indication that this moment carried any personal weight, because for her it did not. Mason took his seat. No greeting, no acknowledgement beyond presence. The door closed, and the process began. Ethan spoke first. "Mr. Reed." He said, his tone unchanged. "This meeting serves as final review and resolution regarding the financial discrepancies previously identified." Mason nodded once. "I understand." Rachel turned a document toward him. "This outlines the findings," she said. "The transactions, their origin, and their classification." Mason looked at the pages. He had already reviewed them. There was nothing new, only confirmation. Ethan continued. "Based on the documentation, the allocation of funds falls outside permitted usage. The resolution requires restitution and formal acknowledgement of the findings." Restitution, acknowledgement. The words were precise, defined. There was no ambiguity left. Mason exhaled slowly. "And if I agree?" he asked. Ethan met his gaze. "Then the matter is resolved internally," he said, "without escalation." Mason nodded. "And if I don't?" Rachel answered this time. "Then the documentation proceeds to external review," she said, "with all corresponding implications." Mason leaned back slightly. The structure was clear, not forced, not pressured, but complete. He looked down at the final page, a signature line, not unlike the one he had handed Paula days earlier in the hospital corridor. The parallel did not escape him. At that time, he had believed he was finalizing something. Now he understood that he had only been beginning it. He picked up the pen, paused briefly, not out of hesitation, but recognition. Then he signed. His name settled into the page. Permanent, final. Ethan nodded once. "Thank you," he said. Rachel collected the documents. The legal representatives noted the completion. And just like that, the process moved forward. No announcement, No conclusion declared, because the conclusion had already been reached the moment the structure had been set in motion. Mason placed the pen down. His hand remained still for a moment longer than necessary. Then he stood. No one stopped him. No one addressed him further, because there was nothing left to address. He turned toward the door and walked out. The hallway outside was quiet, unremarkable. Employees moved past him without recognition, without awareness. Because to them, nothing had changed. Mason paused briefly near the elevator, not because he needed direction, but because he needed a moment to exist outside of the structure that had just closed behind him. He reached for his phone, opened it, scrolled, then stopped. Paula's name, still there, unchanged. He considered calling her again, not to argue, not to defend, but to say something that might align what had happened with something he could understand. The thought lingered longer this time, then faded, because understanding, he realized, was no longer something that could be requested after the fact. It was something that had required attention when it still mattered. He put the phone away and left the building. Paula remained in the conference room for a moment after Mason exited, not because she needed to stay, but because the process required completion. Rachel closed the final file. "It's done," she said. Paula nodded. "Yes." Ethan gathered the remaining documents. "All actions have been executed as planned," he added. "There are no outstanding items." Paula stood, her movements calm, unhurried. "Thank you," she said. Not as acknowledgement of assistance, but as recognition of completion. She turned toward the door and left. Outside, the city moved with the same steady rhythm it always had. Nothing in its motion reflected what had just concluded, because most outcomes do not announce themselves. They simply exist. Paula drove home without distraction, her attention steady, her thoughts aligned not with what had ended, but with what remained. When she entered the house, Lily was in the living room, sitting upright, a book open in her lap. She looked up immediately. "You're back," she said, her voice stronger than it had been weeks before. Paula smiled slightly. "Yes." Lily closed the book. "Did you finish your work?" Paula stepped closer. "I did." Lily nodded, satisfied, because to her, that answer was enough. Paula sat beside her. The moment was quiet, uncomplicated, real, not defined by anything outside of it. Days passed, not dramatically, not with sudden change, but with steady progression. Lily's recovery continued, each day bringing small improvements, more energy, more movement, more life returning to a body that had fought harder than most. Paula adjusted their routine accordingly. Follow-up appointments, medication schedules, gradual reintegration into normal life. Everything structured, everything intentional. Mason's absence was no longer a question. It was simply part of the environment, not disruptive, not discussed, just present in its absence. Mason, meanwhile, moved through a different kind of adjustment. The resolution had not been public. His position had not collapsed in a visible way. But the structure around him had shifted. Responsibilities reduced, access limited, opportunities narrowed, not as punishment, but as consequence. Chloe noticed. Not immediately, but gradually. "Things feel different," she said one evening. Mason nodded. "They are." Chloe studied him. Temporary Mason hesitated, then said no. The words settled between them. Clear, unavoidable. Chloe looked away briefly, then back. Her expression had changed. Not dramatically, but enough. Because alignment for her had always depended on stability. And stability was no longer certain. Paula did not follow what happened next. Not because she was unaware, But because it no longer required her attention, everything that needed to be done had been done. Everything that needed to unfold would do so on its own. Her focus remained where it had always been, on what mattered, on what was real, on what required presence rather than control. One afternoon, weeks later, Paula and Lily walked through a park near their home. The air was light, the kind of day that did not carry weight. Lily moved ahead slightly, her steps still careful but stronger. "Mom," she said, turning back. "Look." She pointed toward a tree, sunlight filtering through the leaves. Nothing extraordinary, but something she had not had the strength to notice before. Paula stepped beside her. "I see it," she said. Lily smiled, and in that moment, everything aligned. Not because the past had been resolved, not because anything had been corrected, but because the present no longer required explanation. Paula did not look back, because there was nothing behind her that needed to be revisited. She moved forward, quietly, completely, and with her everything that mattered. Some stories do not end with confrontation. They do not resolve through loud moments or visible victories. Instead, they settle into something quieter, something more lasting. Because the strongest form of justice is not always seen. It is understood. Paula Patterson never needed to prove anything. She did not argue. She did not expose. She did not return harm with harm. She simply observed, prepared, and allowed the truth to reach its natural conclusion. And when it did, she stepped away. Not with triumph, but with dignity. Because dignity does not require recognition. Only consistency. Mason Reed made his choices, not in a single moment, but over time. And like all choices, they carried consequences, not immediate, not dramatic, but inevitable. If you stayed with this story until now, you already understand something many people overlook. That silence can carry strength, that patience can hold power, and that the truth does not need to be forced to be revealed. I'd like to hear from you. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? And if this story resonated with you in any way, you're welcome to stay for more stories like this. Stories that don't rush, stories that don't shout, but stay with you long after they end.